A young boy, sitting in the courtroom, suddenly lifts his tiny hand and points at a police officer. And then he speaks. His words. They change everything. No one in that courtroom expected what should have been a routine legal proceeding to turn into a moment that would shake the very foundations of justice. What exactly did he say? Before we dive into this shocking revelation, make sure to subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. The atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with tension. It wasn't just another hearing. It was one that carried the weight of unanswered questions and uneasy expectations. Soft murmurs rippled through the rows of spectators. Journalists scribbled notes with hurried precision, and attorneys sat reviewing their arguments, their faces betraying flickers of worry. The towering windows allowed slivers of warm golden sunlight to stream in, yet the room itself felt cold. The polished wooden floor gleamed under the weight of expectation, shadows stretching across it like silent observers of justice. Every seat was filled, some by legal experts, others by the public who had followed the case with morbid curiosity. And then, of course, there was Thomas Bailey. At the very heart of this suffocating tension sat Thomas, a young white man, barely in his 20s. His wrists were shackled, his shoulders hunched, his entire posture one of exhaustion and silent desperation. His gaze remained fixed downward, avoiding the piercing stares of the public. He had been accused of a heinous crime, an assault on an elderly woman, one that had left her battered, hospitalized, and completely destitute. The case against him seemed airtight. The prosecution had it all: forensic evidence, witness testimonies, and a story that made sense. It was a narrative that fit neatly into the system's expectations. A struggling young man from the wrong side of town, desperate for money, with no influential voices to stand in his defense. He was already guilty in the eyes of many, even before the verdict had been read. The prosecutor, dressed in a crisp suit, stood with absolute confidence. His voice was steady, every word sharpened for impact as he laid out the accusations against Thomas. He painted a picture of a man driven by desperation, capable of violence. On the other side, the defense attorney was a stark contrast. His suit slightly worn, his eyes carrying the weight of too many late nights. He fought for Thomas with everything he had, arguing that the evidence was weak, circumstantial at best. He insisted Thomas had an alibi, but no one had bothered to look deeply enough into it. And then, just a few rows behind the defense, sat Monica Johnson. A black woman in her mid-30s, Monica hadn't come to this courtroom out of a sense of duty. She was called to testify. She owned a small grocery store near the crime scene and, although she hadn't witnessed the attack itself, she had seen movement outside her window that night. She didn't believe her testimony would matter much. Sitting beside her, barely able to keep still, was her 5-year-old son, Elijah. A restless little boy, his hands clutched tightly around a small toy car, dragging it along the smooth wooden bench, lost in his own world. The courtroom's heavy energy didn't mean much to him. He was too young to understand the weight of the accusations flying through the air. He did what kids do best: he played. Softly, he mimicked the sound of an engine, making his little car drive up and down the polished surface. Every so often, Monica would hush him, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. But his attention only flickered toward her before drifting back to his game. And then something changed. The courtroom door swung open, and a group of uniformed police officers entered. Their presence was standard, procedural. They were there to maintain order. But among them was a man whose presence was impossible to ignore. A tall, broad-shouldered black officer moved with quiet authority. His uniform crisp, his face unreadable. His name: Sergeant Darius King. In this district, everyone knew Sergeant King. Some feared him. Others respected him. He had a reputation, a man who kept the streets in check, who had climbed the ranks through sheer determination. He was known for being tough but fair, a law enforcer who took his job seriously. But as Sergeant King stepped forward and took his position near the courtroom wall, Elijah stopped playing. The tiny car slipped from his fingers, tumbling onto the floor with a small clatter. His mother turned to him, confused by his sudden stillness. His entire body had gone rigid. His small fingers gripped the bench so tightly his knuckles turned white. And then, in a voice that cut through the courtroom like a blade, Elijah spoke. "I saw him." The words landed like an earthquake. Monica stiffened. Heads turned. A ripple of confusion swept through the crowd as people tried to find the source of the voice. The judge, startled, looked toward the little boy. Elijah slowly lifted his small hand and pointed directly at Sergeant King. He was there. The courtroom froze. For the first time, Thomas Bailey looked up. His lawyer stopped mid-sentence. The prosecutor, who had been flipping through his notes, went still. The judge leaned forward, his gaze locked onto the boy, an unspoken question in his eyes. Monica's heart pounded. She turned sharply to her son, gripping his shoulders. Her mind raced. "Elijah," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "What do you mean?" But Elijah didn't waver. His small frame remained tense, his eyes unblinking. Sergeant King, for a long moment, did not move. His face remained unreadable. But to those watching closely, something shifted. A tightening of his jaw. A flicker of something indecipherable in his eyes. The silence was unbearable. A child, pointing at a decorated police officer, accusing him. Then King took a step back. It was small, barely noticeable. But it was there. A movement of retreat. The judge brought his gavel down. "We will take a short recess." The room erupted. Lawyers whispered frantically. Journalists scrambled to get their headlines down. Officers exchanged quick, unreadable glances. Monica grabbed Elijah's hand, her mind in chaos. A court official approached her. "Wait outside," he said. She could barely nod. She crouched beside her son, brushing his forehead with shaking fingers. "Elijah," she whispered, "what did you mean back there? Why did you say that?" The boy looked at her with innocent certainty. His hands trembled, but his voice steady. "I saw him, Mama. That night, he was there." Monica's breath caught. She wanted to ask more when, how, why. But before she could, she felt a presence. She looked up and found herself face to face with the prosecutor. A sharp-eyed man, his expression unreadable. "I'd like to speak with you." His gaze flickered briefly toward Elijah. "Both of you." Furrowed. "What is it?" They got the other camera feed. Monica felt her pulse quicken. The prosecutor turned to her. "You should come too." She hesitated. Something about this felt too real now, too big. But then she looked at Elijah. This wasn't just about her anymore. It never had been. The new footage was from a different angle. Closer, sharper. The black car was the same, parked at the alley's entrance. But this time, the man stepping out was unmistakable. Sergeant Darius King. The room went silent. Monica felt her stomach drop as she stared at the screen. King wasn't wearing his uniform in the video, but it was him. The way he moved, the way he carried himself, it was undeniable. The prosecutor rubbed a hand over his jaw. Jesus Christ. Elijah, standing close to his mother, barely reached the height of the desk, but he too was staring at the screen. He looked up at her, his voice quiet but certain. "Told you, Mama." Monica swallowed hard. The prosecutor turned to the officer. "Do we have a timestamp?" "Matches the time of the attack," the officer confirmed. "And we got the plate number." Cars registered to King. A weighted silence hung in the room. The prosecutor exhaled sharply. "Pull his financials. Check if we can find anything off in his transactions." Monica's mind was reeling. Sergeant King wasn't just a cop. He was a respected officer, someone who had built a reputation on being the kind of man who cleaned up the streets. If he was behind this, if he had something to do with framing Thomas Bailey, what else had he done? The officer left to follow orders, and the prosecutor leaned against the desk, arms crossed, lost in thought. Finally, he looked up at Monica. "You and your son should be careful," he said. "If he realizes people are looking into him, this could get dangerous."